father and mother worked in labor factories. And since his father was Jewish, he was eventually sent to Theresienstadt. While his mother and father survived the Holocaust, most of his family living in Czechoslovakia did not. Peter and his parents immigrated to New York City after the war.
Been like 5 minutes just trying to adjust the system. Yay. All right. I was 7 years old in 1943 when my father disappeared. I was the fourth. It was the fourth year of the Nazi occupation in Czechoslovakia, and he was not at home. I kept asking my mother about my father, and her standard reply became, "Don't worry, he's on a business trip and will be back as soon as he can." At first, I believed her, but I wanted a fuller explanation. I missed my father terribly, but my mother never told me that he was assigned to a hard labor battalion, or later in 1944, that he was sent to Theresienstadt. She could not tell me the truth. We were a small family of three and shared much, including family meals every evening. As the occupation dragged on, I also saw less and less of my mother. She was assigned to work in a German-controlled textile factory on the outskirts of Prague. At first, I would still see her in the evenings and we'd eat together. But then she was transferred to the evening shift. I would not see her when I came home from school. The availability of food also changed dramatically. During the German occupation, ration cards were issued for everything. As war dragged on, there was less food and fewer ration cards. And there were strict rules about the use of these cards. Often on Sundays, my mother and I had lunch together. Because there was a coal shortage, we ate in the kitchen, the warmest room in the apartment. It was easier for my mother. She could just distribute from the stove, and she was tired from working 5 nights a week. One Sunday, she presented a melody, cooked carrots, turnips, Brussels sprouts, which I like, and a mound of mashed potatoes topped with mushroom gravy, which I always enjoy. Mother hardly ever scolded me, but she was angry that day. As we sat down, she explained that for a while we would have meat, no meat, only vegetables, because the butcher had no meat either. He told her that the Germans were inspecting all of his sales receipts and limiting deliveries. There was not enough food for German soldiers, and according to Nazi authorities, feeding German soldiers were more important than feeding the inferior Czechs. Because my mother was a long-time customer, the neighborhood butchers would sometimes sell her meat, even when he said there was none, if she promised to bring in the government coupons. But that was the main reason we had no meat that Sunday. After a hockey game on the frozen Volta River, some boys stopped at a street cart to get steaming hot dogs with an irresistible aroma. A portly, mustachioed man, bundled up and wearing gloves, greeted us. Each of us ordered a hot dog, which is called a parky in Czech. He took off one glove and poked a long fork into an open vat of boiling water. He speared 2 big, juicy parkies, placed them on a scale, weighed them, and sliced each one in half. He then sliced 4 pieces from a large rounded loaf of rye bread, smeared each piece with yellow mustard, and placed a piece of parky into each slice. His face lit up with pride, like a sidewalk artist who had just finished a quick portrait. Then he asked for 4 meat coupons and 20 Czech crowns. That's when the problem started. Each of us had 5 krona coin, but not one seemed to have coupons for me. I was taking everything out of my knapsack. The parky smelled great, but things looked bleak. After a hectic search, I finally found ours. My mother, anticipating my needs, put the card in my knapsack. But that card was meant just for me, not for the three other hungry boys. I knew it was a bad idea when I handed the street vendor my card, which he took, punched 4 times, and returned to me, saying thank you. I told the boys they had to pay me back soon, but I felt uneasy. When I got home, my mother asked about the hockey game where I'd had a snack, and if I had a snack. When I told her the party story, she crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. Whenever my mother rolled her eyes, I knew I was in trouble. She was upset with what I had done and reminded me of the food shortages. I defended myself by saying the boys promised to pay me back. But mother said the boys could not give me their meat cards, and no butcher would take them anyways. For a week or more after the party feast, I was reduced to eating bread and mustard without any meat. While I learned to tolerate mustard sandwiches, even trying different mustards, I miss those succulent, steaming hot dogs. My mother, ever the pragmatist, became a vegetarian.
Not sure if I said this or not, but this is the Acting 2 class that is presenting these readings. So our next student is Kaylin, and she is reading about Halina Peabody, who was born in Krakow, Poland in 1932. She and her family used false papers in 1941 to live as Catholics in order to avoid capture by the Nazis. The family settled in England after the war.
Left us, three of us found ourselves standing on a sidewalk of a strange city. We had no luggage, very little money that he had returned. Mother spotted a little cafe and decided to walk in. She requested some milk for my sister and then started asking customers if anybody knew a place where we could find lodging. A young man got up, said he knew a washerwoman who took lodgers and offered to take us there. We followed him, and he introduced us to a small lady, explaining that we were looking for a place to stay. Mother told her that we have no money, but she would look for work immediately. Pay her for hosting us. The lady looked us up and down, and I thought she might not take us, but she said she would. Then a couple of her sons appeared, and seeing us, urged her not to take us. You can't blame them. We spent 4 days and nights on the train and must have looked like it. I'll never forget what she said to them, and I am quoting, "Oh, no, no, this is a mother and 2 children. I have to take her." And she did. She gave us one bed, just perfect to keep warm with me sleeping at their feet. The next morning, mother went out and found one of many jobs, which paid for our keep, and we slowly and gingerly started our new life as Catholics. I went to school, and our kind landlady looked after my sister. There were many pitfalls for me. Going to school, I had the advantage of knowing how to read, but had zero knowledge of their religion. Of course, one of the subjects was religion. I was saved by a book which the priest gave to every student. It was called the Catechism and contained questions and answers for us to study. It took me no time to swallow that book, which saved me from being caught with wrong answers. I eventually received communion and managed not to make any fatal mistakes. Of course, I understood that this was role-playing, and I hope not to offend the Catholic religion by pretending to belong. But I did so want to live, and being Jewish was a death sentence, so I couldn't afford not to continue in my role as a Catholic. We were on very thin ice, and anything could give us away, so we were always alert and very careful. Mother knew that our papers may not be real, and so was worried about being stopped in the street and asked for documents. In order to find some security, she tried to sign us up to go to Germany, where they always needed workers. She explained to me that the Germans were not as good as the Poles in recognizing Jews, so it would be safer. However, they would have taken her and me, but not my little sister. So of course we didn't go. In a bold and brave move, she marched into the German military camp and applied for a job. She knew that they would ask for papers, and they did. And we lived in dread during the time that they were checking them. She did get the job and the ID card, which proved that she was working for the Germans. Indeed, on one occasion, the Germans swooped into our home and took everybody to the Gestapo station to check them out. We three were the only ones left because Mother showed them the ID card. The other people who lived with us were taken away to the Gestapo station, checked out, and came back the next morning, but we spared that trip. We didn't know what was going on at the front. Radio and newspapers were strictly forbidden, and being caught with them was punishable by death. With great trepidation, Mother exchanged a couple of letters with the people we left behind, and one of those letters brought us the news about my father. He had sent a letter through the Red Cross that he was free, staying with a sister in Palestine. Great and welcome news. We couldn't do anything about it as long as we were occupied. One morning we woke up very early and were surprised that there were no carts and horses on the street as usual. Silence was deafening. We were discussing whether Mother should go to work. Suddenly there was a tremendous blast. A bomb had exploded over the house. I started screaming, "My hand! My hand!" Mother grabbed my sister and me. We walked into the street and started walking toward the hospital. My hand was bleeding badly. And when we finally got to the hospital, they picked me up and put me in a doctor's office to patch me up. Unfortunately, they had to take my left thumb off altogether, and I lost half of my little finger. Palm was an open wound. They patched me up and put my hand on a rail to keep it straight. They then told my mother that if it got infected, they would have to amputate my hand altogether. My mother and sister spent that night with me at the hospital. When they got back to our lodgings, they discovered that the building was in shambles. The bomb destroyed it. Fortunately, it also caused the ceiling of the kitchen to fall down and kill our landlady. Kind neighbor who took Mother and Ewa in, and we lived there until we left Poland. I spent 2 months in the hospital and owe a debt to my nurses. Catholic nuns kept me from getting an infection, and my hand finally healed. Mother did knitting jobs and was able to pay for our notices she sent to Palestine to help to find Father. But our troubles were not over because Mother was diagnosed with breast cancer and had to have an operation immediately. We finally found Father. He had sent his sister's son already to help us get out of Poland.
Next, we have Allie. Allie will be reading from a memoir by Rosa Marie Berger, who was born in southern Germany in 1921. She lived in a village with many Jewish people, although her English mother and German father were not Jews. She observed the effect of Nazi treatment of the Jews and the effects of the war. In 1948, Rosa married an American soldier and they moved to Michigan.
The village had many Jewish citizens who worked as tradesmen or as farmers. Most were prosperous. During the 1930s, as Hitler came to power, things gradually became more difficult for Jews. I remember the Nazis coming in trucks to our village from other towns. They stormed the homes of Jewish people in the night, using their axes to chop through the doors and break the windows. They took or destroyed all the lovely things in these homes: silver, feather beds, beautiful quilts, even the food that had been so carefully preserved. Many Jewish men and boys were taken away in trucks. They were never seen again. I remember a lady who fled out the back door with her youngest boy when she heard the Nazis breaking into her home. She hid in the bushes all night, wearing only her nightgown. She caught pneumonia and died. Much later, the rest of the Jews were rounded up, the women and children. It was on a Saturday morning, the Jewish Sabbath, a day where the religion prohibits them from work or travel. They were told to bring their clothes and bundles and report to the train station. I hid with a friend behind an electric pole near the train station to watch. It was very dangerous. The Nazis were looking very carefully for anyone who came to say goodbye. I saw girls weeping, my friends, girls I had grown up with. Their bundles were placed in the last car, and the people were herded onto the train. We lived not far from Dachau. I assumed that was the destination. Before the train left the station, the last car was uncoupled and these people's possessions were left behind. The homes that had belonged to these Jews were taken over by the Nazis. After I got a job and began earning money, I decided to buy my mother a radio as a gift. Radios were not illegal, but after the start of the war on September 1st, 1939, listening to any foreign radio stations was a criminal offense, and German courts could sentence people to prison or even death if they passed on what they had heard. Despite this, my mother, being English, was very eager to listen to the British news reports. She would get up in the middle of the night and listen with her ear to the speaker. She would drape a big heavy cloth over her head to muffle any sounds. The news from the British was very different from the news the Germans were broadcasting. Despite the ban, my mother shared the news from the BBC with our Jewish neighbors and other people who were trusted. One day, I noticed that the lawyer I worked for treated me a bit differently. He was dictating a letter, but did not mention any names in his correspondence. This was unusual. It made me very nervous and suspicious. That evening, when he left to catch the train home, I returned to the office and retrieved that file. There, I read a letter from the Gestapo. A Nazi from our village had reported hearing that my mother had been listening to the British broadcast and telling the Jews what was said. The file also mentioned another woman in our village who had been giving food to the Jews. I was terrified. I took the train back to the village that evening. First, I tapped on the window of the woman who had been accused of providing food for the Jews. I asked her if she knew anything. She said she didn't, but I could tell by her voice that she was afraid. Next, I went and tapped on the window of the butcher's house. He was an important man in the village, and I knew him well. I asked if he knew anything about the Gestapo. At first, he denied knowing anything, but I could tell he was lying. Then he confessed that he heard the police chief say they should just leave that old lady alone. So next, I went to the police station. Once again, I tapped on the window pane. The police chief was also anti-Nazi. He too denied knowing anything, but finally he admitted knowing that my mother had been reported. The butcher was one of our circle, but it turned out he had a nephew in the Gestapo. He promised this nephew all the meat he needed for his family until the end of the war and offered to pass out his son's clothes to his family as well if he would promise to make the file disappear. Sure enough, the file became lost. In those days, many foreigners were assigned to work on farms. They worked with the farmers and ate their meals with them, and then returned to camps at night. Some were prisoners of war, French and English soldiers, and there were also many Polish civilians who were forced to work for the Germans in this way. Still, some people were quite brave. The woman who worked at the post office sometimes received mail and packages from the Jewish people who no longer lived in our village. She forwarded these packages on and tried to smear the return addresses to protect the senders from the Nazis. As the war progressed, the bombing became even more severe. I remember once looking up at the brilliant blue sky and seeing the bombers emerge from behind the clouds. I watched as the bomb doors opened and the bombs rained down from the sky. Our village was not damaged in the bombing raids. However, the Allies bombed a neighboring village about 2 miles away. Many bridges were destroyed, most of them by the Germans themselves as they fell back retreating from the Allies. The Americans entered our village on Easter Sunday, 1945. On the previous day, there had been a lot of shooting. That evening, the last of the German troops had pulled out. They told us they would not be back. During the night, we took refuge along with 20 or 25 other people in the cellar of a neighboring farmer. In the morning, the farmer knocked on the cellar door and told us the Americans were arriving. We took pieces of white cloth and hung them everywhere. Since I spoke English, it was decided that I should approach the soldiers and ask them if they wanted anything. I remember clearly walking up to a tank. The hatch at the top of the tank opened and a soldier emerged with his gun pointed directly at me. I asked him if he wanted anything. He didn't seem to understand. I explained again and the farmer's wife wondered if they needed anything. After talking to the other soldier in the tank, he said they would like fresh eggs. The farmer's wife filled a large basket with eggs, and I handed them up to the soldier in the tank. As he lowered the basket through the opening, I explained that the farmer's wife would want her basket back. He understood, and in a few moments, he reappeared with the basket. In the basket were several bars of chocolate, something we had not seen in 6 years since the war began. At one point, there were rumors that the Americans would be leaving, and we would be occupied instead by the Russians. We were terrified, because we had heard all about the Red Army's brutality towards the Germans. We knew what would happen to the women and children with no one to protect us. I remember weeping, and one of the American soldiers tried to comfort me. He promised to take me with him if the Russians came, but I had my mother, and I would not have been able to leave, even if this was a promise he would have kept. The Americans were not what we had expected, and I'm sure we were not what they had expected either. The Americans were informal and direct. They didn't show respect for the people that they dealt with. We, on the other hand, were used to a more formal, structured society. It all changed after the war. Hitler and his war, it was his fault. Germany changed, and the traditional way of life in small villages was lost forever.
Next, I'm going to be reading from an anonymous journal that was found after the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, which happened in late April, early May of 1943. The writer of this diary found a place to hide watched as the Nazis forced the Jewish residents out of the ghetto. Our living conditions were very poor, especially from the moment we took in 45 people. 3 days have already passed. 3 days without hot food. It is forbidden for anyone to converse in order to maintain silence. For every question, one receives crude and offensive answers. People in the bunker, in contrast to the previous behavior, have adopted a very insensitive manner of behaving. Our lives are currently in danger, and the quality of life is very low. People are half naked, badly dressed, run by in a melancholy manner along the stone floor. They are not able to live. They are not able to die. And in a later entry, I myself am surprised how it is possible for people to live and survive in 3 weeks in such conditions. We know very well what sort of an action this is, as was announced in advance. This is the liquidation of the Warsaw Jewry, and with it, our end and our destruction. The Germans used to attack us this whole time at night. Now, they are broadening their attacks to daytime as well. Therefore, we have to keep quiet on our plain beds so that the enemy doesn't hear where we are. Days pass well. The sound of shots and machine guns and explosions of grenades. At night, however, it's possible to go out in the streets. And then after they started firebombing the ghetto, I go out on the street, it's burning. Everything around is going up in flames. The ghetto is a sea of flames. There's a strong wind that fans the flames and carries sparks from burning buildings to those that are not burning. It immediately destroys everything. Fire expands to such an extent that people do not have time to run from their homes and tragically die. People with bundles run from house to house and street to street. There's no hope for rescue. No one knows where to take shelter. We search desperately. There's nothing. No salvation, no refuge. Death prevails everywhere. The walls of the ghetto are completely surrounded. No one can exit or enter. Clothing is burning on people's bodies. They shout out for pain and cry. Buildings and bunkers are on fire. Everything stands in flames. Each person searches for rescue. Each person wants to save his life. People are choking because of the smoke. They call for help. Many, almost all, call out to God. Oh God, show your strength. Have mercy on us. God remains silent. He doesn't answer. And later, the ghetto has been burning for 4 days. Only chimneys and the skeletons of burned buildings remain. In the first moments of witnessing such a sight, a person can't help but shudder. Yes, this is the work of Hitler's vandals, who want the whole world to look like this. They certainly will not succeed. In our thoughts, we retreat to the past. We've lost many things that we achieved, many years of work. The only thing left to us is our shelter. Of course, it's not a safe place for the long term. But we live by the day, the hour, the minute. Next, we have Lauren, and she will be reading from a memoir by Irene Safran, who was born in 1923 in Hungary. And in 1944, She and her sisters were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. They survived, but were the only ones in their family to survive, along with their brother, and they eventually moved to the United States in 1949.
Our homeland, Czechoslovakia, had been annihilated in March of 1939. Our region was returned to Hungary, from which it had been taken over after World War I, while other sections of the country became a German protectorate. I was 21 years old in early April 1944, when my family and I were first forced to leave our home in the predominantly non-Jewish area where we lived in Munkacheville and moved to Jewish Street in the Jewish ghetto. We brought only those possessions we could carry and lived on the floor of someone's house. Jewish Street was the dirtiest street I ever saw. After a few weeks later, the order came for us to get ready to leave for relocation. Germany was weakening against the onslaughts of the Allies. The shipments of Jews to concentration camps were continuing on a regular basis. My journey to Auschwitz-Birkenau began on May 19, 1944, when I boarded the train with my parents, 3 younger sisters, and 2 brothers. It was an afternoon in Lager See in Birkenau, my home from May to November 1944. When Miguel strode in to inspect the living conditions of the 800 prisoners housed there, he looked like a movie star in his high boots, white gloves, and impeccable SS uniform. "Good afternoon, ladies. How are you? Are you comfortable?" he asked politely. No one said a word. There was only complete and utter silence. We were immobilized with fear, afraid that the penalty for daring to speak to this terrifying figure would be death. The people on the bottom level of the 3-tier bed were crouched over. They had no room to sit up straight. We looked like animals in a cage with our shaved heads and the ripped rags wrapped around our emaciated body. 14 people slept on each tier, shared one blanket. We were like sardines. When one person wanted to turn, everyone had to turn. For years afterward, I had a black mark from lying on my side on that wooden board. "When will I see my mother?" one woman finally asked in a very low voice, almost like a whisper. "In a few weeks, don't worry," Miguel answered politely and pleasantly. "When will I see my little girl?" A second woman got the courage to speak when she saw that the first woman hadn't been beaten for speaking up. Miguel gave her the same answer. We almost believed him. He looked so elegant and civilized compared to us that we felt like we were looking at a god. Of course, he meant that we'd see our loved ones in a few weeks when we joined them in heaven after going up in smoke from the crematorium. We arrived at the platform of Birkenau at dusk on Sunday evening. It was Shabbat. We disembarked the train and we were told to line up in rows of 5, men to one side and women to the other. It was always in 5s. Old people and those who didn't have the strength to walk were told to go to the wagons that would take them to their new homes. We left our packages behind, which the soldiers said would be delivered to us. After those 3 days on the train, we couldn't even think anymore. We lined up as they instructed us, not having any idea what was ahead. Esther, my younger sister, had been very sick in the train, so I told her and my mother to go in the wagon because it would be easier for them, and we would meet later. I never saw either one alive again. My mother and my 12-year-old sister, with beautiful long blonde braids, were both gassed to death and cremated that very night. We were told to remove our clothes and place them in cubicles provided. We were given soap and took a group shower, after which we were led into another room where all our hair was shaved from our heads and bodies. We were given gray cotton shift dresses, which were the only material possessions we ever had at Auschwitz. Then the SS woman took over and began marching us to the barracks. It started to rain, and when I felt the drops of water bouncing off my bare head, I began for the first time to feel very frightened. We were awake at 4 a.m. The first morning
that first morning and asked what our skills were. The maids and cooks were the lucky ones. Their skills were needed, and they were given regular jobs. The people who had no skills that were of immediate use to the Germans were chosen to perform odd jobs, like hauling rocks from one place to another. We were then lined up like the rest of the camp for a mass counting, which was to become a standard procedure. At 4 a.m., the entire prisoner population would be lined up in rows of 5 for counting and inspection. Selections were made for the gas chambers. If someone couldn't be accounted for, the entire camp had to kneel until the person was found, dead or alive. Anyone who stood up was killed. And every morning, prisoners who had decided to kill themselves could be seen lying dead by the electric fence surrounding the camp. By that night, all of us were terrified and crying. A prisoner who had been there for a while came into our barracks and said, "Do you know where your parents are? They're up in smoke," pointing towards one of the chimneys. That's when I realized my parents and my little sister Esther were no longer alive.
Our next reader is Ananias. He will be reading from an oral history done with William McKinney, who was drafted into the U.S. Army in June of 1943. He was in the Combat Services Supply Outfit, which followed the Rangers after they took Omaha Beach on D-Day. His unit continued through France, Belgium to Germany, and the Battle of the Bulge. They then liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp. This was taken from an interview for the Shoah Visual History Foundation.
They had this camp, and there were thousands of Jewish refugees in it. It was in deplorable condition, this camp. I saw the Jewish refugees dressed in blue and gray striped like uniforms. They looked like pajamas. And then they had other prisoners who were faced in blue. Their eyes were sunken in, their faces were sunken. They started to look like skeletons with just a skin over them. They'd have one dead, 2 alive, 2 or 3 dead bodies laying. The medical said we shouldn't give them okay rations. They hadn't had anything salty to eat in such a long time that it would kill them. Then there were 2 little Jewish boys, as close as I remember. The names were Paul and Jordan. And there had a field and we had a field there where we set up a field kitchen. And these 2 little boys were digging out in the garbage can with their hands, eating this food. And I told them, no. So I communicated with them to the best of my ability, trying to get them to understand. And we finally got to reach a point where we understood each other. Then I went and got a basket of food. And after he finished, he breathed it, and I slew it and gave it to the other. They were clinging to me for 2 days. They had some civilian clothing. They didn't have pajamas. They had regular little outfits that were with their age. Never mealtime. I would catch them. They knew where we'd be served. They would come. No one gave food. And then we had to move on into the dark. But the authorities told me no, that they had set up orphanages for these children, displaced persons, displaced children. All I got out of them was that the Germans had made them stand and watch when they marched their mother and father to these furnaces to be burnt in the body. They grabbed onto my legs, I had to say goodbye. I told them, I have to go. Each one was thinking to each other. I patted them on the shoulders and head until I happened to them. So I said, I've been over here fighting with them. I don't have time to think. I don't have time to play nursemaid to the monsters. At the end of the interview, Mr. McKinney was asked, what would your message be to them? It's time to lend effort to It's time to lift every effort of one's beings in trying to establish peace and harmony throughout the world. There are these United States of America and throughout the world, and throughout the world without bloodshed. It's time that we came to our senses and lived. Because war is no. War is war.
Final reading will be from Chase, and he will be reading from an oral history with Leon Bass, who volunteered for the United States Army in 1943 at the age of 18. His all-black unit, the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, entered Buchenwald in April of 1945. This is also an interview for the Shoah Visual History Foundation.
Of concentration camps. But on this day, April in 1945, I was going to have the shock of my life. Because I was going to walk through the gates of the concentration camp called Buchenwald, I can never forget that day. Because when I walked through that gate, I saw in front of me what I call the Walking Dead. I saw human beings that had been starved, had been tortured, had been denied everything that would make anyone's life valuable. There was this young man who spoke English. He began to tell us about who he was. He said that all these people were Jews. They were gypsies. They were Jehovah's Witnesses. And there were some Catholics, some trade unionists, communists, homosexuals. And I knew that in my judgment, Nazis had placed them here because the Nazis were saying that none of them were good enough. Therefore, they were not fit to live. They could be terminated, murdered. Man, I couldn't get a handle on this. And as I got close to one building, I could see the dead bodies. They were staggered outside of the building, about 4 feet high, well, maybe 5, 8, 10 feet stretched across. They were up against the building called a crematorium. I went inside and I saw 6 ovens. 6. I walked over and I looked into them. What I saw was left someone who had been placed there. I saw a man's blackened skull, rib cage, bones, the ashes. I said, Leon, that could possibly happen to you. And it's all because of bigotry and prejudice. And all of that hate, anti-Semitism was right there. It had been carried to the ultimate. In fact, I didn't know the enormity of what I had seen. I thought Buchenwald was it, but I didn't know Buchenwald was placed all across Europe. And then when the man told me that there were about 50,000 prisoners in Buchenwald, about 2 or 3 weeks before it got here, but then they began to do something and said, kill them all. Taking them on marches, out on trucks, and so when I got to the camp, there were only about 20,000 left. So it made me know that there was an organized, systematic way of destroying people. When I asked why he wanted to share his experiences, Bass answered, I've been trying to give testimony for a long time by just going around and speaking to people. No one's looking for credit. No one wants a pat on the back. All we want to do is say, will this be prevented from ever happening again?
Thank you all for being here. I'd appreciate it if you would give my students another round of applause for their work today. And also, I do have to plug our next event, which is Schoolhouse Rock Live. Yes, it is based on everybody's fun and favorite videos and the songs that helped us learn all of the things we probably knew and still know because we know those songs. It is next weekend on the 11th, 12th, and 13th of April. On the 11th, it's at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then on Saturday and Sunday, it's at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. BU faculty, staff, and students are free. It's only going to run about an hour or a little longer, and it's definitely family friendly. So if you have any questions, just call the Red Skelton Performing Arts Center, and we hope to see you there. Thank you all so much for coming today.